Hi everyone. Absolutely chuffed bits to be working with Lily Jones Events on this. Yeah, we plan to do a physical event earlier this week actually, because it was Earth Day on Wednesday, and unfortunately that got cancelled. So I said to Lily Jones Events if we'd planned on still doing a virtual version, and just thought it would still be really good to sort of share some ideas and sort of people's thoughts on sustainable events. So with that said, I'd like to pass over to Lily Jones Events just for a short introduction. Over to you.
So thank you all so much for coming. Like Danielle said, we had planned to do this all in person, and it was going to be really interactive and fun, but we will make it as interactive as possible today. So really the idea about sustainability in terms of wedding businesses, I've come from an events background. And it wasn't, a few years ago, it wasn't really something that we just, it was always in the back of our mind, but we didn't actually really think about what we could do to make our events more sustainable. And then last year, I planned my first ever zero carbon footprint vegan wedding. And this couple were amazing, and they had this whole thing written down about how they didn't want their day to be such an impact on the environment, basically just one day for them. So really that's when I sort of met herself, and when she what she does and things like that. But it's all about finding those little things that we can do as wedding suppliers, as brides and grooms, those little things that we can do that can just change the way, our impact that we're having on the environment, really. And it's better to do something small than it is to do nothing at all, really. So I wanted Danielle to be able to tell you all about her amazing ideas, because I'm starting to run out of them. So I know that she'll have loads on it. But yeah, so I'm here for any questions, wedding perspective and things like that. But I will hand over to Danielle, because she's the expert, and she'll give you some more information.
Super, thank you so much. So yeah, so just to give you a bit of an intro to me and sort of my background, I'm by no means a wedding expert. I'm not married. I've never planned a wedding, although I feel very prepared, having done quite a bit of research for today. But I have worked in corporate events for the last 10 years, mainly in financial services. And I got really frustrated with all of the single-use plastic, all of the waste, all of the, doing events for events' sake. And decided to leave and set up my own company focusing on sustainable events. So I look at sustainable event management, consultancy, as well as helping people find sustainable venues and also sustainable event suppliers. So I'm part of the Positive Impact Ambassador Scheme, and also part of the Sustainable Event Alliance. And I like to work within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. I'm going to just give you a bit of info on that in a bit to help, but it sort of just helps structure, sort of give you some ideas on the sort of the themes and things that you can look at doing. So I'm coming at this from a sort of a corporate event experience, but the principles around sustainability and what you can do are very much the same. Super. So in terms of sort of my ethos, it's all very much around sort of creating memorable experiences with purpose and with style that reduce the negative impacts on the environment, but also drive that sort of social positive impact. So for me, I don't think it's ever about sort of compromising on anything. And hopefully from today, I can show you how you can still have an amazing wedding and still plan and have a beautiful day, just without the bad bits. And I think that's ultimately what I am trying to deliver. So when I was sort of thinking about, setting up this company, and you think, you're bombarded, I think, often with messages around, reduce, reuse, recycle. And that, you know, is a big part of it, but only part of it. There are a hell of a lot more, you know, R words or re-words, if you like. I'm just sort of putting up a couple on the screen now. But for me, it was really just thinking about, you know, what can we start refusing to use? You know, we don't have to always, you know, it's not the status quo to keep using the same materials. What can we repurpose? What can we reject from the outset? So there's quite a few different things that you can think about. And for reward, it's definitely about sort of reflecting on that event management process and how we can start doing things differently. It's about rethinking the impact that your events have, positive and negative, and just reimagining the whole event experience. I think for me, people try to sort of shoehorn sustainability in sometimes at the 11th hour, and you think, oh, you know, I've got an event next week, I better make it sustainable. And it's not really something that you can do last minute. You need to build it into your strategy. But hopefully I'll give you some food for thought and some ideas as to how you can reimagine and rethink that whole process. So before we sort of get into it, you know, what on earth is sustainability? I think the term is thrown around a lot. Sustainable business, sustainable development, living more sustainably. And I think often there's a lot of confusion around what it means. So I'm curious to get you know, your thoughts on that. So this is our first interactive poll of the day. So if you would like to go to slido.com, if I activate this screen here, there's a QR code on the screen, so you can either scan the QR code or you can go to slido.com and put in the code 3112. And this is a word cloud, so that you're able to put in a sort of one word or two words, and you can enter a number of times because there's lots of different meanings to this word, just to give us a thought on what does sustainability mean to you. I'll just give you a couple of minutes just to put that up. And everything's anonymous and there's no judgment at all. There's no right or wrong answers. I'm just curious to see what people's thoughts are. I've been running some events, some interviews actually this week, and speaking to actual sustainable event suppliers. And their interpretation of what sustainability meant is very wide ranging. So there's definitely no right or wrong answer. Fabulous. Okay, cool. Minimal, environment, negative, impact, environmentally conscious, harming. Excellent. Really good. Any other thoughts on what sustainability might mean? Fabulous. Long-term, less waste, natural. Brilliant. Great. So I think you can see, you know, the bigger words are obviously the ones that get mentioned more. So thinking about being more minimal, thinking of the long-term impact, natural. Yeah, these are fantastic. Brilliant. Excellent. Thank you very much. So you can see that it's definitely, you know, incorporates a lot of different themes and messages and can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And as I say, there's no right or wrong answer. Fortunately, as I said, the UN sort of devised this framework called the Sustainable Development Goals back in 2016. And this was essentially shared to create like a blueprint to help people understand, you know, what sustainability is all about. And for me, I try and think about sustainability as sort of creating a world that works for everyone. So that sort of element of balance and being able to really sort of future-proof the world that we live in. So within these 17 development goals, there are 169 targets. There's also a load of indicators to check how you're sort of doing against those goals. So it all gets very complicated. But ultimately, you know, you can think about it being broken down to three things. So looking at the environmental protection side of it. So I know environment came out as a key theme. So that's when you're looking at the clean energy, the climate action, life below water. So I think often people think about sustainability as being the environment and thinking about climate action. So that's definitely a big part of it. But there are two other sections, and that is social progress. So that looks at, you know, education, equality, good health and well-being. It's all about the people and the community aspect. And then also lastly, looking at sort of economic growth. So that's the elements in here around sustainable cities, industry and innovation. So they're all interlinked, just to make it even more complicated. But the good thing is, with that, if you do tick off sort of one box, you're often sort of positively impacting something else as well. So if you want to think about it in terms of a definition, so sustainability is meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations. And one that I've sort of adapted slightly when thinking about events, and we can apply it to weddings as well, is the sustainable event management is the process of integrating environmental and social responsibility and issues into your event planning. So just a sort of couple of different ways to think about it. I mean, ultimately, we all know that events, whether it's a corporate event or whether it's a wedding, they're all very temporary in their nature. As soon as we're setting it up, you feel like you're packing it all away again. And the problem is, although they're temporary in nature and sort of last moments in time, the waste that they create and the negative impact they have is a lot more permanent. So we need to think about, what can we do to reduce that negative impact? And weddings are no different. So I'm sure, a lot of you are familiar with these statistics. I've just stolen them from hitch.co.uk, but just to sort of give a sort of a feeling as to, how big is this problem that we're dealing with? So, the UK wedding industry, and this is just UK's weddings, £10 billion industry. You're looking at sort of 250,000 weddings happening per year. The average spend, and this number varied a lot actually, but the sort of the key reports are saying it was sort of over 30 grand now that people are spending on their wedding. Biggest spend tends to be spent on the venue, but then you've also got some sort of quite positive things, that 7% of brides are opting out of flowers, but still 93% will still have flowers. And 40% of brides are making their own cake now. So there's sort of a real adjustment into people doing things for themselves and being a bit more sort of creative, often I would imagine to sort of save money, but also that has a big impact environmentally and sustainably as well.
Hang on, can I just stop you there?
Yeah, of course.
Let's ask you, I'm a florist, so can I just ask you why brides doing their own flowers would be classed as sustainable?
Well, the thing is, it's when you think about, and that's a really good question, and I've got a whole section on floristry, so I might cover it in a bit. But in terms of, a lot of them tend to sort of pick their own, whether they're growing their own in their own garden or sourcing them themselves. But it's thinking about, the plastic that might be coming in the packaging, and where, if we're not flying them in from sort of exotic places. If they're making them themselves, it tends to be sort of homegrown.
Okay, can I appreciate all of that. I think it's a fantastic point, but could I just counterbalance that with one of the points that you said about sustainability is about having people and poverty. So obviously, yes, where flowers come from, there's a huge amount of people that are affected. So if everybody stops buying flowers from florists,
yeah,
obviously having British grown, local grown, all that packaging is absolutely spot on. But it is important that we realise that if we take trade away from those developing countries that rely on flowers, as a crop, we are actually doing a damage and a disservice to sustainability. So I think that's something that we do need to be mindful of.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think with sustainability, it's all about balance. So it's not about,
it's a tricky one. It's a very tricky one.
Yeah, and there's not one rule that's going to tick all of these boxes and you're going to have the most perfect event. But that's a really good point. So where you may be being more sustainable in the sense of the environment, you're not being sustainable in terms of supporting the economic growth priorities. So that's really, really good. And I think what one good thing that you can think about, and even just I think thinking about this, is a massive step forward. But one thing to think about is, if you do want to do that and you think, okay, actually, yeah, let's support, I do want these exotic flowers, or I do want to support businesses that are sort of not local, thinking about, what else could you do within the wedding to sort of offset maybe those flight costs or that carbon emission impact. And so it's about sort of, I think, compromising on, what do you want, in which case, if I want that, I'm going to have to sort of offset it somewhere else and sort of trying to balance it out. But that's a really good point. Thank you, Joanne. Super. And any time, everybody just shout out with any questions. So next question. Oh, sorry. obviously we've got, as we've spoken about, there's a number of sort of the worst offenders, and we know we're all here to talk about, you know, the dark side of the wedding industry. So what do you think are the elements of a wedding that have the biggest negative impact? So again, we're going to do a quick poll. I'll just set it up now. Sharing the screen. So what do you think are the worst wedding offenders that have the biggest negative impact on a wedding? So that could be, you know, as we just said about floristry. You could be thinking about plastic, food waste, absolutely brilliant. Thank you. I was just written that one on there. Thinking about, you know, what's creating those CO2 emissions that are so harmful. Just give you a couple of seconds to type those in. Brilliant. Disposable favours, absolutely. Decorations. Great. Travel, brilliant. Exotic. Honeymoon, really good one. Excellent. Fireworks. Brilliant. I think that's wrapped sweets. Yeah, brilliant. Confetti. Excellent. Cool. Really good. Thank you, everyone, for your thoughts on that. So pretty spot on, and maybe because I jumped ahead like you saw, but we've got these are the sort of the worst wedding offenders that we've got here. So ultimately, you know, you are looking at single-use plastic, and you are looking at the CO2 emissions and food waste being the biggest thing. But exotic flowers and decorations are also some of those top offenders as well. So just to give you a couple of stats on this as well. The average wedding creates 20 kilograms of plastic waste. So every single wedding is creating 20 kilograms of plastic waste. And if we think about, you know, we've got over 250,000 weddings a year, you're then looking at 5,000 tons of plastic that can't be recycled. This is unrecyclable plastic. And is just going to pour into the oceans or just fill up our landfill and isn't going to go anywhere for a long, long time. So that's the equivalent in weight of 47 blue whales of plastic created from just, and this is just the UK wedding industry. When we think about the food waste element, we tend to have, you know, a 3-course meal. Often, or 15% are only eating 1 or 2 of those courses. So, you know, one of those courses is going in the bin. 15% of couples are throwing away leftover cake. So that again is another food waste element. And when we think about sort of food wastage, so an average family's home is roughly going to throw away around £700 in food waste a year. And if you think about sort of putting that into context of a wedding, you know, a couple of hours at a wedding can account for 65% of your home's food wastage for that year. So someone else in. So, you know, these are big figures, and food wastage is a massive problem in the events industry, and obviously weddings is no different. Somebody mentioned confetti, and I think the use of balloons. You know, lots of people like to let those balloons off. And, you know, where do they end up? Often in landfill, often in animals. You know, they're a choking hazard. So, you know, they're not going to be biodegrading for any time soon. There are biodegradable options, but they're not going to be going anywhere anytime soon. And then from the CO2 emissions front, and it can be anything from travel to, you know, your caterers coming in, the band, the energy used for the venue. I think we've mentioned honeymoons. We mentioned, yeah, you're creating that 14.5 tons of CO2 emissions. And again, to just give you some context on that, everyone in the UK creates around sort of 9 tons a year of CO2 emissions. So, you know, again, you're thinking about a wedding, that's your sort of year and a bit of CO2 emissions. So, fortunately, you know, there are alternatives, and the rise of sustainable weddings is increasing, and, you know, a lot of brides and a lot of businesses supporting brides in the wedding industry, you know, it's your magical day, and the day that you dreamed about probably since you were a little girl, you know, and you want everything to be amazing. And so thinking about the negative impacts or the environmental impacts, it's no surprise that's often can sometimes get forgotten about, but fortunately people are starting to focus and think about this a little bit more. So I'm just going to take you through some sort of top tips and sort of areas where we have got an amazing array of sort of different suppliers that can help with making your event more sustainable and making your wedding sort of greener and more eco-friendly. So before we get into that, this is the last poll. Just curious to hear from you all around sort of how popular do you think sustainable weddings are? I've certainly seen a lot of popularity in the research that I've been doing. We've got a couple of options here. So really popular, and it will only get bigger. Do you think it's popular, you know, if you like that sort of thing, but not for everyone? Do you think it's a bit of a fad, but don't think it will last? Or do you think it's not very popular yet, and sort of people are still trying to get on board with it? So if I give you a couple of minutes just to have a vote on that. What do you think? How popular are sustainable weddings? Okay, interesting. So majority thinking really popular, will only get bigger. A couple of people on the fence. Any other thoughts? I mean, certainly in the sort of the corporate event industry, it's something that's being spoken about a lot more, and people are being a lot more mindful to it. I guess the benefit we have in the corporate world is, you know, budget is a big thing, and also companies are having to think about their sort of reputation and a sort of CSR PR policy, which is slightly different in the wedding industry. You know, if a bride wants a certain thing, and they're paying, so you know they ultimately can choose how sort of green that they want to go. But no, that's really interesting. So 63% think it's really popular and will only get bigger. So that's really, really encouraging. And that's certainly, you know, from, as I say, the research that I've been doing is certainly something that, you know, I found. You know, I don't think you can read a wedding magazine now without there being like a green article or a focus on sort of how to make your event more eco. And it's I certainly think it's, you know, one of the biggest wedding trends out there. And, you know, maybe I'm a little bit biased, but I think this looks absolutely beautiful on here. So, you know, lots of people are wanting that more rustic feel. There was a stat actually that I found that 42% of couples said that they felt under pressure to have a Pinterest or an Instagram wedding, you know, with a quarter of those surveyed even wanting to spend more money to sort of making it more Instagram or Instagrammable, which was quite interesting. Barns and farms are the most sort of popular locations for weddings. So again, sort of goes hand in hand with that sort of natural, environmentally friendly feel. And I think the Church of England, I read, was even sort of making their churches more enticing for sustainable weddings because they were getting so many requests, which was quite interesting. More newlyweds.
You with them just this,
oh, yes.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely brilliant, and I get lots of this. I mean, I do a lot of my weddings look just like this, but I think what's really important is and I think that eco weddings will become more and more popular, because I think it will become like that generation that are coming through that are getting married, you know, in the 20s, are very, very, very aware about sustainability. Yep. But I think there's a huge difference though about something being sustainable and looking sustainable.
Yes.
And that's the key, because I get lots and lots of rustic weddings, but it's then just how do we translate that look into something that is genuinely sustainable, and that is the key, because a lot of people, they want it, but they don't necessarily want to pay for it, because there is a price tag attached to it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, you know, in the corporate world, and, you know, weddings will be no different, is that whole greenwashing concept in terms of people looking to be doing the right thing or saying the right thing, but actually it's not quite as good as it sounds or as good as it looks. Yeah, that's a really good point. Thank you. Yeah, totally. And something came off actually on one of the polls there about honeymoons being one of the big impacts. So a stat I found is that most newlyweds, or more newlyweds should I say, are opting for a UK honeymoon, which is interesting. So I'm not sure what you all think about that. But searches for sustainable weddings are up 181%, and green wedding ideas have increased as well, over 5,000% in the last 5 years. So it's certainly, you know, I don't think it's going anywhere, but absolutely, Joanne, as you said, it's important that it doesn't just look the part, but actually, you know, there's a bit of a science going on behind it. Cool. So I've got a couple of different bits and pieces here that I can take you through that can sort of help I think sort of give you some ideas around how to make different parts of the wedding day sustainable. So the first thing, and food waste was mentioned. So sustainable catering. So food waste is definitely one of the worst offenders at a wedding. And then when you look at sort of the CO2 emissions that come from, where is that food being sourced? What are you actually serving? It all builds up. So I think we mentioned about brides growing their own flowers. Some brides are choosing to make their own wedding breakfast, which I'm not sure is something I'd be signing up for. But with 40% making their own cakes, anything is possible. But the key things here really are to sort of go local and go seasonal. So we have an expectation, I think, now that you can get anything, any vegetable, any meat, any exotic item that you want any time of the year. And I think in order to sustain the catering and to sustain our food source, we really need to be eating more seasonally. So if you want raspberries in December, they're probably not going to be local. So just think about, there's a reason they're called summer fruits, and think about sort of supporting those local businesses and choosing sort of seasonal foods. You also need to think about what you're serving. So red meats, so such as beef and lamb, have a much higher negative environmental impact than the vegetarian options when you're thinking about sort of the water that's used and grazing, etc. So we need to think about leaning on more vegetarian options. And a lot of people will say, oh no, but I really want to have meat at my wedding. So if that's the case, you can look at sort of more game options, which are a lot more environmentally friendly, and I think still have that sort of premium feel about it. Some new popular trends that we're seeing are grazing tables. So again, avoids the problem of having to worry about complicated seating plans, and that people can sort of just help themselves, and also more sort of a sharing dessert platters, that sort of thing that makes it a little bit more interactive. But also sort of keeps those costs down and those environmental impacts down. It's really important from a serving perspective that we reduce the reliance on disposable cutlery and using real plates, real knives and forks, real glasses. If you have got an outside venue, obviously you do need to think about sort of that disposable serviceware, but that's when you need to be thinking, there is veggieware, there is biodegradable food serviceware, but again, they need to be disposed of in a certain way, and there's a hell of a lot of water that goes into creating those in the first place. So if you can use real plates, real knives and forks, real glasses, that's always the best way to go. And then you don't need to have bottles of water on the table, certainly not plastic bottles. Having sort of pre-served jugs of water with real glasses can keep that plastic down as well. And then when we're thinking about sort of leftover food, a lot of it, we can talk to our venues and to our suppliers about, can we compost any of this, or can we repurpose any of this, rather than it just ending up in the bin. So sustainable catering is number one. Sustainable floristry, and I'm keeping an eye out, Joanne, so do shout if there's anything you want to add to this bit. But another big battle that we have in the wedding world is flowers. So as we said, the majority of weddings will have flowers of some kind at their wedding, for everything from your bouquets to your buttonholes to the centerpieces to archways that the bride and groom will walk under. So how can we think about doing this more sustainably? So similar to the food, ideally you want to be sticking to local and seasonal suppliers from an environmental perspective, but to keep those CO2 emissions down. So you don't necessarily want to be shipping in sort of exotic things from far away, but as Joanne said, in terms of sort of keeping that economy going over there, if that's something that you really want and is something that's important to you, then absolutely do that. But then maybe think about focusing more on the catering. And you can pick and choose what is going to work for you. That's what makes this sort of as flexible as possible. So if you're opting for, flowers that tend to be out of season, they'll be industrially farmed. They'll probably have used a lot of pesticides and a lot of chemicals to get them, perfect, nice straight stems and everything. So just think about that. There's a growing a sort of surge in the use of wildflowers and also dried flowers, which don't have, as big a negative impact on the environment. And then for some, I found this beautiful image of, a bouquet that had been made out of buttons. And so there's some really, for some more quirky weddings, that people are actually making bouquets out of things other than flowers and decorations out of other things other than flowers. But also another key thing, avoid that horrible floral foam and plastic. So when we're talking to suppliers, anything that comes wrapped in plastic, we obviously want to reduce all of that and keep it as natural and as plastic free as possible. Joanne, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge subject, and I've worked in the flower industry for lots of angles. So I used to work in growing, and I used to work up in Lincolnshire, so I know all about the British growers, and I also know about the Kenyan growers, and because obviously the people that we worked for, they had farms out in Kenya, so I understand all of that. And obviously the Dutch auctions, so it's a very, very complex issue. I always talk to my clients about staying seasonal and local where possible, but it's not always possible, or sometimes the bride, they are hell-bent on a certain look and a feel, for example, like the toffee rose or the quicksand, and that has to come from, the likes of Colombia or Ecuador. So that comes in like that. So obviously, but you're offsetting the carbon emissions with the good that you're doing for the economy out there, because you're providing jobs. There's often fair trade, there's schools, there's medicine, there's all sorts of things that the farmers actually do for those people that work in that industry. So it's not necessarily about exotic flowers, it's more about the staples that you see, that come in, that you don't think much about. But there is a massive, we're getting much better at looking at our sort of seasonality and our local, in this country. And I think one of the things that's coming out of this situation that we're in at the moment with this COVID-19 is that we're all having to sort of redress, about what we can have now, because obviously you can't get the things that you perhaps would just be able to go just like that. So it's just trying to, I think you have to ask the question, you have to make people think about it. Certainly floral foam is a definite nasty, and if it can be avoided, it has to be. But sometimes there is a time where people say, well, I have to use that, and it might be something like a funeral. Obviously, we're not talking about funerals today, but there are other methods, and it's about going back to traditional techniques. So it's about knowing your trade. So, we use lots of moss, and there's lots of other things that you can use rather than foam that are equally as good. Yes. So there are lots of ways, plants as well. I mean, loving seeing the lavender plant there, because I often say to people, plants are a really good way of being sustainable, because you can have locally grown plants. So again, same thing with plants as with flowers, they can often be farmed, somewhere else and bought over, which is not sustainable. But in the UK, there's a big growing network. So, and they can be repurposed, gifted, and then obviously they have a purpose afterwards. They can go into the garden.
Absolutely, yeah.
There's loads that you can do, but dried flowers is something to look out for as well, because sometimes there's an element of things that are not as sustainable there as you would think. So they've been bleached. There's processes which things go through which are not necessarily as beautiful as they are when they're finished. So you know what I mean? You've really got to do, there's so much depth to this subject area. It's very complicated, I think.
And I think, like you say, I think it's about, being curious, and like you say, just asking lots of questions. And I think, like you say yourself, and there's lots of other sort of sustainable florists out there. A friend of mine, she has her own sustainable floristry, and she was saying that, she was finding that a lot of the flowers were all just so regimented that she used to sort of ship in. Everything had a very straight stem. They were all exactly the same color. And she said, the wildflowers and the flowers that she was growing, it just sort of had a romance of its own, which I thought was a really nice way of putting it. That isn't, too regimented.
Yeah, I think what's funny, I mean, we've been a family of florists for a long, long time, and the family business is at well over 100, 150 years old, and we've got lots of old pictures, and it's just really going back to basics.
Yeah,
it is absolutely stripping away all that sort of, everything has to be immediate now, having everything that we want when we want it, and it's about just simplifying things.
Yeah, and I think, like you say, just those expectations, and just thinking about what's important to you, and what is a sort of a non-negotiable. We absolutely want to have this, and then other areas that you're a little bit more flexible on. Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Super. So the next one is looking at sustainable stationery, and it was funny. It was only when I was sort of thinking about how many invites, do you send? So you send an invite, or you send to save the date, sorry. Then you send an invite, and then you ask them, an RSVP card, and then you're probably going to send a card to say thank you for the gift. I mean, that's 4 pieces of, pieces of post, 4 envelopes, 4 stamps. So never mind the sort of the paper impact, but you're also thinking about the cost of actually sending all of that out. So obviously there's a big surgence at the moment sort of in that digital RSVP process, so that you can host all of your invitations online. But I understand that there is an element of, an excitement about opening that sort of personalized invitation. You've got your own insignia from the couple, and it's beautiful. Unfortunately, there are lots and lots and lots of amazing stationers and people that are sort of homemade and a lot of sustainable stationery options that are out there. What I really love is the invitations that are printed on seed paper, so that you can actually then plant that, and there's no waste at all, because often you think, well, actually, am I going to keep this invitation? I mean, unless you're the mother of the bride, probably not. So you need to think about what are those invitations made of, and what are you going to do with it afterwards. But as I say, there's lots of good options out there. Really nice idea is sort of doubling up your favors and your place cards. So we've got an image there where people have sort of written on leaves that are on the table. But as Joanne said there about sort of doubling up your favors, it's actually something that someone can take away with them, that's been personalized. It is really nice. There's a sort of a surge in the use of projection. So instead of having maybe like a printed order of service or a printed table plan, you can look at how you can project that onto the wall, which can then be replaced with maybe like some family photos or couple photos during the wedding reception, which is really nice because, again, once you've had the wedding, are you necessarily going to look back at that or order of service? And also with table plans, we know that your second cousin might be bringing along his new girlfriend that you hadn't planned for, or maybe someone's not going to turn up, and having to make all those last minute changes. Having a digital version and being able to project that and make those changes last minute is also really very helpful. So just a couple of ideas there on sustainable stationery. And again, plastic packaging is a big issue there. So if we can sort of keep that down and sort of, a lot of these sustainable suppliers wrap everything in nice brown paper and just keeping that as natural as possible. That is fabulous.
I add in,
yes, please do.
Just the amount of weddings that I've done, and I would say about 60% of favours just remain on the tables and no one actually takes them.
Yeah.
So I mean, I don't know if there are any brides and grooms in here, and it's certainly for the planners as well. I always say to my clients that it's not something that everyone remembers to take. It's not a necessity, and people get so wound up about favours and what they should give people. And at the end of the day, I'm clearing most of them away, and most of them going in the bin anyway. So
yeah. No, that's so true. We're coming actually to decorations actually, and that's perfect in terms of the favours, because exactly. I mean, I think a lot of the weddings I've been to, people have been making their own favours. Whether it's little bottles of drink or sweets, and I think we've all been to weddings where we've had that sort of plastic bag, nice plastic bag, but full of the personalised M&Ms or something like that. But again, thinking about the packaging, that things are coming in and are actually people going to be taking them. As you say, most of those end up in the bin. So yeah, it's thinking about how can we double up on things, and is it something that it is like a little potted plant or a little succulent that you can take away, or just don't bother with them at all. They're not essential items, and it's not something that you need to think about necessarily investing a lot of money in. So balloons, I think we're all very clear on sort of the negative impacts environmentally that they can have. They're made of latex, they're made of nylon and all sorts of horrible plastic chemicals, and which take years to decompose. So there are biodegradable options out there that are made of the sap from rubber trees. So that there are options, but also you can think about sort of other ways to decorate your venue. So I think using the floristry that we've mentioned before, with still those sort of principles apply, but I think that's a really nice way of decorating. Confetti, I think somebody mentions that on one of the the negative, one of the worst offenders. And again, that's made of microplastics. That's just going to get thrown up in the air and just going to sort of just stay where it falls, really. That's not going to decompose for a long time. So there's now options for dried flower or even bubble confetti, and you can see that picture there, which I think is really stunning, and the sort of the light can sort of work really nicely with the bubbles. So I think that's really lovely. When we're thinking about decor, I mean, for me, when I'm thinking about sort of sustainability, I'm thinking about sort of reclaimed items. So what can we repurpose? And often, you know, it's better to hire or borrow something rather than going and buying a load more things that you're probably not going to want. You know, 25 you know, centerpieces once the wedding is finished. Some couples as well are investing in sort of really decent pieces, statement pieces, which they then can have at home after the wedding, which I thought was really nice as a nice reminder. So when we think about table favours, as I think was mentioned, you know, we've got those ideas where, you know, they're personalised, or you've got the plastic bags. But thinking about, you know, edible gifts, that's also really nice. That can be something that, you know, there's no waste, and it's got your name on it, but then also you can eat it. And so there's no waste there as well. So there's a few different ideas, and also that the wildflower seeds, again, in recycled and recyclable packaging, and then you can actually go and plant those seeds afterwards, and that's just something, just like a nice giveaway if you feel that you want to do that or have to do that. But thinking about those green favours. Super. So a lot of these options and a lot of these ways of thinking about things can be covered by working with, you know, the right suppliers, the right partners, and I think the venue can cover a lot of this. Certainly in corporate events, it's something that I sort of encourage my clients, you know, let's make sure if we get the right venue, a lot of these boxes are ticked. So, you know, you don't have to get married on a farm or in a field in order for it to be sustainable. There are a hell of a lot of, you know, eco venues out there that will help with this. And so we just need to speak to them really about their eco credentials. So like we were asking before, just ask lots of questions, you know, how energy efficient are they? Do they have solar panel? You know, are they growing their own? Some of these venues have, you know, their own biodynamic farms. Are they composting? You know, just lots of different questions that if they're an eco venue, that they're going to know off the bat, and they'll be able to help you with that and be able to design that perfect day for you. We also need to think about the location. So is it easily accessible for people to get to? Can you get to it by public transport? One of the big CO2 emissions obviously is coming from all of the individual cars traveling to and from the wedding. So if we can think about, you know, doing some group travel, so whether it's the buses or coaches that can help people sort of get to and from the wedding, that's really helpful as well. Also, if you can try and do the blessing, or sorry, the ceremony and the reception in the same venue, that sort of reduces that travel in between both locations. That can also help. And something to be mindful of, you know, there's a picture here of like a really beautiful marquee. If you want to use marquees and tents, obviously we need to think about sort of the time of year. In the summer, are you going to need to pump that full of air conditioning? And in the winter, are you going to need to pump that full of heating? So just thinking about that energy consumption that those sort of external sort of tents and teepees that you might have to think about. And then also, you know, when you're thinking about weddings, obviously this is one of the key occasions that people are going to maybe fly in from all around the world. But thinking about, you know, obviously want them to be there, and there's only one way that they can get there, but thinking about sort of offsetting the carbon for their flights. And there's a number of different initiatives of people where you can sort of offset the carbon footprint of those flights, because that's something that you can't do too much to reduce. But yeah, just a couple of thoughts there on sustainable venues. Okay, so just a couple of other things that I just sort of came across, and wasn't 100% sure on who would be joining, so I just wanted to make sure we'd sort of covered lots of different things. So when we think about hair and makeup, you know, most brides and bridesmaids, I certainly, when I was a bridesmaid, loved having my hair and makeup done for the day. And a lot of people have, you know, suppliers that come in and do that. So it's just, again, working with natural products that haven't been tested on animals. We're trying to keep chemicals reduced, and again, reduction on sort of plastic packaging. When we're thinking about the wedding cake, you know, as we said, 40% of brides are now making their own. But if you're not, and if you are a cake supplier, thinking about, you know, organic ingredients, and trying to keep it, and they call it, like, you know, as naked as possible, so as natural as possible, and decorating it really nicely without sort of necessarily big, thick icing. So there's sort of just a few ideas for cakes. And also, you know, I think we said 15% of people are actually throwing away leftover cake, but actually there's nothing stopping you from actually freezing that and then enjoying that, you know, a couple of weeks after the wedding, to sort of relive the big day. So think about, you know, not throwing things away. Dresses, you know, there's a big sort of increase, I think, in sort of vintage dresses, and buying and sort of wearing sort of pre-loved dresses, and also having you know, a dress that may not be, oh, that's obviously you know, a wedding dress, or something that can be adjusted, that can be, you know, worn again. Because I think essentially, you know, I always find it quite funny that guys tend to sort of rent their suits, but brides don't tend to rent their wedding dresses. And you can absolutely rent a wedding dress, but people tend not to do it. So it's thinking about sort of something vintage, or something that you're not going to necessarily just wear just that one time. Having an ethical gift list. So over 50% of couples now are asking for, you know, cash towards their honeymoon, which is fair enough. But if not, thinking about, you know, if you wanted to support a certain charity, or something like that, if you didn't necessarily want, you know, another 4 toasters, which might not necessarily be something that you're interested in. And then photography, I found quite a few interesting sort of eco photographers. You know, I was thinking, actually, how could you improve that? And there's just a sort of a number of different ways and number of different things around sort of how they approach the process. So, you know, if you are having lots of meetings before the wedding, can they be done over video conferencing as opposed to in person? How is that photographer getting around and getting to and from the wedding? Can they, you know, with the actual prints, a lot of people, you know, are now obviously doing digital copies, and then you can choose which ones you want to download. And then any albums that they're making are sort of, you know, printed on sort of eco-friendly materials. So there's just a sort of a few different things that you can think about from a photography standpoint. So really, just to sort of, I guess, sum up before we go to sort of any questions, is really back to sort of what I was saying before about sort of my ethos as a company, and sort of rethinking that whole process. And these are just a couple of questions to really just sort of think about, whether you are, you know, a bride planning a wedding, whether you are a sustainable or wanting to be more sustainable in your business as a supplier. Is, you know, do we really need it when you're looking at a wedding? You're planning, you know, do we really need it? Can we hire it? Can we borrow it? Or can we make it? You know, making things yourself is often a, you know, a easier way of making things more environmentally friendly. Then also thinking about, you know, well, what is it made from, and where has it come from? These all have impacts. How are you going to use it? Where are you going to use it? And ultimately, what's going to happen to it afterwards? So, you know, it's called the circular economy, in the sense of, you know, making sure that, you know, whatever you're buying, where's it coming from? What are you going to be using it for? And where is it going to end up? And that can inform a lot of the decisions that you're going to make about what you want to invest in. And, you know, that when we were talking about, you don't have to do everything, and some things, you know, are going to be deal breakers, and some things are going to be a little bit more flexible. But often thinking that these questions can sort of help bring that to light. So in summary, these are just a couple of things, just to think about. I would focus on sort of buying local and seasonal. And you know, whether it's CO2 emissions that we're trying to reduce, or whether it's the plastic, the use of single-use plastic, you know, and plastic is everywhere, whether it's from food storage to the cling film to the, you know, the giveaways, you know, it's everywhere. So it's really trying to keep that sort of that plastic footprint down. So yeah, buying local and seasonal, whether that's food or flowers. Borrowing, hiring, or making it yourself has a big impact. And reusing existing items rather than buying new. I think that's a big part. There's, you know, anything that we can do to reduce any single-use items, not just plastic, but anything that we're using just once, we can reduce that. Going digital, so whether that's with your invitations, or whether that's thinking about projection and how you can sort of avoid printing and avoid paper. Invite less people, you know, an obvious one and maybe a little bit cutthroat, but you know, these sort of more intimate weddings are becoming increasingly more popular. So that's you know, the micro weddings. So that's always something to think about. But really, you know, I think it's important to sort of just get across. It's about doing what you can. It's not about getting hung up on everything and making everything perfect. It's just about sort of understanding, you know, what's important to you as a couple, and sort of making those decisions based on, you know, what do you want to have, what's an essential, and what's something that actually, you know, do we really need that? Probably not. Super. And I just wanted to leave with this quote, which I thought was really nice. A great marriage is not when the perfect couple comes together, it's when an imperfect couple learns to enjoy their differences. And I thought, you know, I have a very similar perspective around sustainability when it comes to this, in terms of sustainability is not about being perfect. It's about sort of just rethinking the whole process, rethinking the whole design and strategy that goes into it, and just looking at things differently and reevaluating, and sort of really making best choices. So I hope I've given you some ideas of things that you could experiment with, and hopefully proven that it's not about compromising, and that you can still have an amazing day, an amazing wedding, just without the bad bits. Well, thank you all so much for joining. Really appreciate it, and all your input. I hope that you found it useful. Take care.